I'm with the State Chamber of Commerce. We've been around for about 108 years. We've spent almost all of that time representing Minnesota businesses at the state capitol. One of the things about immigration and immigration issues is it's a federal issue. There are a couple of exceptions. If the Congress would pass an immigration reform bill, there would be some issues related to that legislation that would require changes in state law. But for it to work and to be effective nationally, especially for employers, for example, who have operations in more than one state, it really needs to be a national policy. At least that's our perspective. So the state policy aspect of immigration reform is pretty specific and narrow, and I can say more about that as we go here. The reason I tell you that is because I want to emphasize the significance of the fact that not just the state chamber, but the organizations involved in the Minnesota Business Immigration Coalition are all state trade associations, and for us to be as engaged as we are in a federal issue is a big deal and unusual. I've worked for the state chamber for 25 years. We've worked on exactly two federal issues: healthcare reform, and we did really well there, and now immigration reform. We hope to do better on immigration reform than we did on healthcare. So it's unusual. I passed around a one-page policy statement, and I'll comment more on that later on. But for now, I just want you to look at the range of organizations that support this particular approach to comprehensive immigration reform. It's a pretty broad group, and whenever I look at that list, it kind of always makes me ask, so what's the holdup? I mean, when you look at just the range of organizations that say they support immigration reform, why can't the Congress and the President get it done? So with that, our interest in this issue is purely driven by the impact of immigrants on the economy, the Minnesota economy, the national economy. A lot of discussion of immigrants and their role in the economy focuses on that first item, immigrants as workers. But one of the big things that we've learned as a business immigration coalition and as trade associations is that immigrants contribute to the economy in many other ways. The four that we want to highlight today: first, workers; secondly, entrepreneurs; third is consumers; and then fourth, as a bridge to what is increasingly a world economy. And so I hope what you'll take away from this is that immigrants are really key to the development and growth of our state's economy. I'm going to introduce Maura. She's going to talk about that first aspect, immigrants as workers, and then I'll pick it up and talk about the other three, and then we'll get a little bit into the national legislative picture, and then also what you can do as a community to welcome and to better utilize immigrants as a part of this region, this sub-regional economy. Maura?
Okay, well, I'll add my good morning and thank you for the invitation to be here with you and kind of share a little bit of the university's role, I guess, in this broader topic. Certainly, the University of Minnesota sees itself as an organization that, because of its research focus, should be pulling together information and data to make available to anybody who has an interest in this topic. And so that's one of the key things that led to this duet with Bill this morning is the University of Minnesota about a year ago undertook a study with the goal of pulling together data around changes in Minnesota's workforce and the growing importance of immigration to support our workforce needs. So the university, again, has that real focus on research and data. We also, obviously, through the teaching mission, we're teaching and training a number of folks coming from a range of different countries around the world. We have over 8,000 students currently from different countries around the world. So we, too, have a vested interest in policy changes and changes towards the future that might allow us to continue to see the skills that those students are receiving continue to benefit the state and this country going forward. And then the other way the University of Minnesota is directly involved in this very topic is we have a number of other centers and institutes that are providing services and programs both to further the education of the community around these topics, but also to, again, provide services to those that are themselves providing services to others in this space. And I'll touch on that a little bit later in this presentation. So as Bill said, first we're going to talk about workforce, and I guess the way I would frame this up is we are starting with asking you to imagine the future a bit, and the future for Minnesota, and we are imagining this future based upon demographic shifts that we are seeing today. And I suspect many of you have already seen quite a bit of this data. The State Demographer's Office has done a great job of putting a lot of this out for public availability. And so our team took a lot of that same data and coalesced it into a specific report. And I passed around a one-page document. On the back side of that one-pager is the website. If you go to that website, you can find the full report, and you can download it for your own use or share it with others that you work with. And then you'll also find 2 appendices, which I'll touch on a little bit later, as well as some supporting PowerPoint figures and so forth. We would encourage you to take advantage of this content and use it in whatever way supports the work that you all are doing. Okay, so this particular graph summarizes sort of the big picture view, and that is that as we're seeing today, there are tremendous demographic shifts occurring at the national level, but also at the state level. And here in Minnesota, I think we all know that our population is aging and that we're seeing an increase in ethnic diversity around the state. We also probably are aware that those changes are not necessarily uniform county by county. And in the report, you can see some actual visual representations of the differences that are occurring as you look across the state in those trends. This particular graph shows the projection starting from 2015 on the far left all the way out to 2069. So again, imagining the future of what we think will be happening here in Minnesota. And what's really very interesting is if you look out to about 2040, that's when the blue line, which is natural change in population, births minus deaths, the population line crosses the 0 point. So that's when, if we just rely on natural population change, we would actually see that the Minnesota's population will go negative. So this is, again, why there's such motivation for having these conversations around workforce. So if that trend is the only trend that we would have controlling population, we would obviously be in a significant challenge in filling our workforce needs. Thankfully, we do have a migration line also shown on this slide, and that's the red line. And that's showing that we are actually seeing positive migration to the state, and it's that positive migration that's resulting in our still being able to have a population projections that are positive going forward. But if you look at the difference between the blue line and the red line, it's, to me, an inescapable conclusion, and the conclusion in the report, that Minnesota is going to become ever more dependent upon in-migration to keep our population growing. So that slide did not distinguish between international migration or domestic migration. And so we don't necessarily know today what will happen, in 2050 versus, when we think about international migration versus domestic, but we can look at what's happened historically in the past decade or so, and I think from that make some pretty reasonable projections about what we need to see continue into the future. And so that's what this slide does. This shows data from 2005 to 2013. So 2 different groupings. 2005 to 2010 are the gold bars, and 2010 to 2013 are the blue bars. And total net migration, as the previous slide demonstrated, has been positive over those years. But what's very telling is that the reason that that has been positive is exclusively because of the international net migration. Those are the middle two bars. The domestic net migration has actually been negative in those years. So this, you put those two slides together, and this is why Bill and I are going around talking about the importance of immigration for Minnesota's workforce. So those are our slides showing demographics. Now you overlay those demographic changes on labor force, and that's what this slide is showing. And it's really showing, especially on the far right side, the worsening gap between the number of jobs that we have available and the number of people that we have available to fill those jobs. And so that gap on that far right side is what we're really thinking about when we're making the sort of emphasis around the importance of continuing to attract more people here to the state in order to fill our growing labor force needs. And we have some projections in the report that really are pretty dramatic numbers that, out into this 2040 and beyond time frame, we're going to need to attract 4.5 times more people than we're currently attracting to keep a labor force growth of 0.5%. So we're not talking about huge labor force growth percentages. And even so, if we don't do anything beyond what we're doing today, we're going to have a shortage that would only be overcome if we could attract 4.5 times more people to keep to that growth rate. So again, you coalesce those slides and a lot of other information that's in the report, and our conclusions are that the future strength of Minnesota's economy will depend upon our ability to both attract and to integrate. It's not enough just to get people here. We need to get them here and help them to be successful when they're here to join Minnesota's workforce. And yes, we will be competing with other states around the country who are looking at similar demographics and similar shifts that are needed. So we must use our existing human capital and then do everything we can to be an attractive state to welcome more people into this region. The map on the right, it shows foreign-born population in Minnesota by county, 2010 to 2014. So one of the next messages that we're going to talk about in this morning's presentation is, that's imagining the future. There's a whole lot of work that's going on today that will help us, I believe, continue to be successful as we think about this future. And some of that work that's going on today is because of what you see on this map, the fact that we are already seeing significant foreign-born populations in certain parts of the state. And so we can look to those regions of the state for lessons that they've learned and build off of those experiences, hopefully to be even more competitive and more attractive as a region going forward. With that, I'll turn it back to Bill.
One other point related to the role of immigrants as workers, and you see it in these two pie charts. The one on your left is shows the immigration levels of the immigrant workforce, and then on the one on the right are the educational levels of the native-born workforce. And what you see is a kind of a bipolar distribution. The immigrant workforce actually on the high end tends to be better educated, and on the low end tends to have smaller percentage-wise, folks who have a high school diploma or a GED. So it's kind of a bipolar distribution. And for me, it's important because as I visit businesses around the state, there isn't a company that I don't go to where A, I don't see immigrant workers, and B, I don't see them at every level of the operation. So I see them in the front office, I see them on the shop floor, I see them in the warehouse, in the distribution center. I mean, they really are, part of the economy at every level. This is a picture of some workers at SterilMed. They reprocess surgical instruments in Maple Grove. Very kind of precise, precision type work. It's mostly an immigrant workforce. And so you can, when you leave here today, randomly stop at a business and just look around at who's working there. We really have become very dependent in Minnesota on immigrant workers at every skill level. And as Maura points out, that trend is just going to accelerate as we move forward. So let's take just a minute and talk about these other three roles. First is entrepreneurs. There are about 16,000 immigrant entrepreneurs in Minnesota. There are about 2,000 in the 2nd Congressional District. That's kind of the closest data that I could get to this part of the state. So about 2,000. Statewide, these immigrant entrepreneurs employ almost 65,000 Minnesotans, and they're critical, more important than I think a lot of us might understand, because our state's economy is first and foremost a homegrown enterprise, more so than any economy that I've studied or seen. We really depend on the startup and success of local enterprises, and immigrants contribute to that in a pretty substantial way. So just to illustrate the point, these are the state's 16 Fortune 500 companies. So these are the publicly traded or equivalent companies in Minnesota. What's the kind of one thing that they all have in common, other than the fact that they're headquartered here?
They're all homegrown.
You're right, Mark. You've heard this before. You're right. Yeah, right. You get a gold star. Yeah, they're all homegrown. And actually, of those 16, 40% of them were started by immigrants or their children. So that's, and you know, it's 264,000 jobs. That's a lot of jobs from relatively few companies. And if you expand our thinking to bring in some other Minnesota companies like Lifetime Fitness or D-Care, you can make an even longer list of businesses that in Minnesota that were either started or are now run by immigrants. So a very significant contribution to the startup and development of Minnesota companies, and statewide. So then you kind of look at immigrants as consumers, as shoppers, about $9 billion per year in consumer purchasing. Of that $9 billion, that's kind of statewide. About $2 billion, actually $1.5 billion of that is in the 2nd Congressional District, so in your part of the state. It's a significant amount of shopping by any measure. And, you know, one of the immigrants come to Minnesota from all over the world. They bring all kinds of different cultures and traditions. But one of the things that they really, A, learn the quickest, and B, do just as well as anybody else in the room is shop. They really do pick that up from our culture quickly. And I can tell you or take you to small towns around Minnesota where the downtown is literally being reborn because of immigrant consumption. Just take a ride down, you know, downtown Faribault or Worthington or Lake Street in Minneapolis or University Avenue in St. Paul. Those communities have really been rebuilt mostly. Those retail centers have been rebuilt mostly thanks to immigrant shoppers. So that's as shoppers, as consumers. And then fourth, finally, is this kind of bridge to the world economy. Whether we like it or not, we are in the middle of an increasingly global economy, which is actually a great thing for Minnesota. Most of the world's consumers are outside the U.S., like 90% of them. And the world economy, by and large, is growing a lot faster than the U.S. economy. And then finally, just to make it even more interesting for Minnesota, our businesses are great at producing the things and the services that growing economies really want and share and like. So a world economy, a growing world economy, despite what anybody says, is really a great thing for our state. But we need to be able to relate to those folks in different cultures and different places. And the presence of immigrants in our state really helps us do that. It adds diversity to our communities. It makes somebody who's coming here from, say, Mexico or India to invest millions of dollars in a Minnesota business feel more comfortable about doing business here. So on this slide, I have just a couple of examples. You know, our steel industry, the taconite industry on the Iron Range, it's an overwhelmingly foreign-owned or immigrant-managed. There was just a story yesterday in the paper about the expansion at the Thunderbird mine up by Virginia. They added a $75 million processing. Well, that's owned by Cliffs. Cliffs is run, I think, by an Italian. It's based in Cleveland, mind you, but its management is pretty much international. But also, if you look at Gerdau, which is not in either of your counties, it's kind of on the edge of Ramsey County, they take cars, crush them, and turn it into rebar. That's a Brazilian company. They just invested, what was it, $50 million to rebuild their plant? Those folks need to feel comfortable about investing in Minnesota. And having an immigrant population here really does, believe it or not, help that happen. Our food processing industry, more and more, not just, you know, we think about maybe immigrants in the processing plant. Well, actually, they own a lot of that capacity. JBS, another Brazilian company, now owns Golden Plump. They also own the pork plant in Worthington. That's 2,300 good-paying jobs, you know, in southwestern Minnesota. So this fourth role as a bridge to the economy is really key. So kind of when you bring all this together, you bring the demographics and the workforce data that Maura presents together with immigrants' role as entrepreneurs, consumers, and a bridge to the economy, a bridge to the world economy, it's pretty hard to escape a conclusion that immigrants really are key to both the development and growth of the state's economy. Just a couple other things, though, that are important to kind of keep in mind. I'll be the first to admit that when somebody from another culture, another country comes to Minnesota, there is a period of adjustment, and there are definitely expenses related to that adjustment. You guys, in the work you do, you see it every day, especially counties. So no question. But this is a case study that was done by Professor Bruce Corey at Concordia, where he just looked at the socioeconomic status of our state's Hmong population in 1980, so about 6 years after they arrived, and then in 2010. And just pick one of the measures, and you'll see how there's just substantial growth. I mean, look at the percent of households that own homes, 12% to 49%. Or the percent receiving public assistance drops from 67% to 14%. And there's no reason to believe that this pattern wouldn't be the case if we did it, say, for the Somali population. The folks that come here, whether they come as a refugee, like the Hmong, or as immigrants, most of our Latino population, they're just motivated to do well. They chose to come here. So makes a big difference. And then these are statistics for the 2nd Congressional District, and I could refine this if you want, but I just want to highlight the number of entrepreneurs in this 2nd Congressional District. Almost 1,500 of them, 16,000 statewide, but about 1,500 here in the 2nd Congressional District. And like I said, the consumer spending, almost $1.5 billion out of $9 billion here in the 2nd Congressional District, and taxes paid about $500 million. I think sometimes folks forget that even when somebody first arrives here, they're paying taxes. If nothing else, when they shop, they're paying the sales tax. So then, before I talk a little bit about the legislation, I just like to remind everybody that we've been here before. You probably can't read this, but this chart goes back to 1850. So, and in about 1900, 35% of Minnesota's population was foreign-born. A lot of the businesses that we're all benefiting from today were created by those immigrants or their children or their grandchildren. And so, and you know, we took a little bit of a hiatus, but immigration is now rising again, and they're from different parts of the world. You know, that previous wave was Scandinavians and Germans. This wave is, you know, Somalis and Hmong and Latinos and folks from Eastern Europe. But there's no reason to believe that this wave won't contribute as much as that previous wave. So we've been here before. When we think about immigration reform, and that's what's highlighted on the sheet that I distributed, we really see it as having kind of 4 parts. First is to fix the administrative aspects of the immigration system so that, as the governor likes to say, things move at the speed of commerce. And you know, one particular aspect is the E-Verify, the system that employers today use to verify whether or not somebody is legal to work. Making that system not only more user-friendly, but so that it doesn't make mistakes is really important, because when it makes a mistake, if it tells me that I can hire somebody and it turns out it's wrong, then I, the employer, have broken the law. If it gives me, though, a false negative, so if it tells me that I can't hire Vicky when she, in fact, is legal to work, then again, I've broken the law. So fixing these administrative aspects of the system is really important. Secondly, we continue in this country to have a series of quotas determining how many people are going to come here and from where. We, the business groups, would like to move away from quotas and go to a more dynamic system so that we change the levels of immigration based on current economic conditions. And the good news is that our understanding of the economy today will allow us to do that. We have the technology to be able to make adjustments pretty quickly. 50 years ago, we couldn't do that. And that's just for immigrants. Refugees are another matter. I can comment on that later if you want. But immigrants, these are folks who choose to come here. Refugees don't, they choose to leave the country they were in. So that's a more dynamic system. And then third, we need to resolve the status of the 11 million folks that are in this country without authorization. And we would do kind of a 2-part system. We would provide them with a path to citizenship or a path to permanent residency. And in both cases, there would be hurdles that they would have to clear to resolve their status with the law. And then fourth, and it's fourth on the list intentionally, we would make sure that our borders are secure. And the reason that I say it's fourth on the list intentionally is it's our belief that if you do the first 3 things, if you clean up the administration of the system, if you move away from a quota system to one that adjusts with economic conditions, and then resolve the status of the 11 million that are here unauthorized, we'll have more secure borders by just doing those 3 things. There'll still be some things that we can do at airports and at the border, to make them more secure. But these first 3 steps will go a long way towards securing our nation's borders. So that's kind of our take on reform. I wish I could tell you that there's a bill in the Congress right now that would do those 4 things. There isn't. To the extent that the Congress is working on immigration issues right now. It's on a kind of a piecemeal approach, much of which is aimed at more enforcement. And, more enforcement doesn't address these concerns. More enforcement is just more enforcement. It doesn't give us a 21st century immigration system. And with that, let me turn it back to Maura.
Okay, well, in addition to hopefully seeing continued movement on policy issues, as I mentioned earlier, we still have to think of ourselves as a welcoming state if we're going to get those folks that are maybe increasingly coming to the country to want to choose Minnesota. So again, in the report, we go into much more detail on that particular topic. What are some things that Minnesota should be considering, as well as at the national level? And I've just condensed that down here onto this slide. And so again, we could spend probably hours on each of these bullets. I'm going to just kind of go through them at a high level with you today, and certainly if there's time for questions, we can go into things a little bit more deeply. I would say first and foremost, and I suspect you all are right in the midst of this already, it's clearly important that as a state, but also as individual communities, we have a strategy for how we can approach this need for being communities that are welcoming, communities that have resources and services that support immigrants at the different stages that they navigate on their workforce journey. We also clearly need to continue to focus and prioritize education. And education covers multiple levels. Obviously, from the university's perspective, we think a lot about training students and professional students and so forth. But there's also needs to train children of immigrants, so much younger educational needs. Recognizing foreign credentialing is another issue that we are very much concerned with at the university. And investing in workers at all stages of their workforce journey. And certainly English learning is a key requirement and benefit if those workers are going to be fully integrated. The third area is one that obviously is not unique to this question about immigration and workforce, and that is how do we as a state and as a society address racial disparities. I think the more we continue to show progress there, the more we will also see the benefit of being a more welcoming community for people coming from a variety of countries around the world. The next area is being able to have difficult conversations and to be cognizant of the fact that there are going to be social tensions and that we need to have conversations in which we are trying to listen to all perspectives and to manage through those conflicts. And I personally have seen quite a bit of progress in this area in a number of different communities, and I applaud that willingness, as I said, to tackle what are sometimes very, very difficult conversations. And then the last area, but by no means the least important, these are not in any rank ordering, is we need, I believe, to recognize and coordinate key roles. Minnesota, we have a lot of great organizations doing phenomenal work in this space. But one of the things we've come to recognize is there's sometimes a left-hand, right-hand disconnect. And there are sometimes limitations as to what one organization can do in terms of what stage they can provide help. And then there isn't a seamless handoff to the next organization that can provide help for the next phase of the journey. So I think one of the ways that we can be a much more effective state, and certainly this is also true at more local levels, is to provide a network of services in which there's more seamless transitions for people and different stages of their journey. So then we were asked to kind of think about highlighting some success stories. So I mentioned earlier that even though much of this is about imagining the future, there's a lot of great work happening today. And so I would direct your attention when you have a moment to go into the website, again, that I referred to earlier, and we have Appendix A there. So after you get through the full report that has a lot of the demographic details and a lot of the recommendations for future work, we have an appendix in there. And Appendix A profiles two communities, Worthington, Minnesota and Rochester, Minnesota, both of which have been experiencing these changes for quite some time and therefore do provide a good focal point for asking the question of what's worked, what hasn't worked, what is sort of areas of continued need going forward. So I'll talk briefly about some of the examples from those two case studies. And then the third case study describes the important work of faith-based organizations and isn't necessarily specific to a city or a region, but is more talking about that important cluster of providers. So when I looked through those case studies last night and kind of thought about today's conversation, it was clear to me that there's sort of three big categories of work and successes. And it really is, in this case, grouped by who's doing the work. But again, I don't want to paint the picture that these people are working necessarily in isolation. But certainly there's a lot of great work happening from a number of different nonprofit organizations. And I've listed three categories, and I already mentioned the faith-based organizations. Rochester's Intercultural Mutual Assistance Association, which is a mouthful, they abbreviated IMAA. That's an interesting example where they've been around for quite a long time, and they recognized that Catholic Charities did great work with immigrants for a defined period of time, but then there was a need in Rochester for another group to kind of pick up and carry that work forward after the Catholic Charities work had to kind of come to an end chronologically. So IMAA sort of picks up and takes that journey with the immigrants to the next stages. And so they're typically assisting about 250 immigrants per year. And they provide a variety of services, much of it in interpretation, language services, and they have a particular focus, not too surprisingly, in Rochester on medical terminology, and so they've done a really great job there. Project Find, focused on integrating newcomers through education, is another great example of sort of a group that's found an important niche that they're filling. Some of that is focused again on educational needs that immigrants have. They also do a lot with providing referrals to other systems, and quite a bit in terms of parent mentoring, which is, again, another important niche. And that group is also thinking about sort of educational pathways and pathways for receiving college education and so forth. So that group is doing great things as well. If we jump down to employer support, this is a key area that, again, I think it's great to see employers represented in this group today. Employers play a very key role in successfully integrating immigrants from a variety of different geographies into our communities. And so I've listed sort of three general categories that employers are key in providing. One is supporting employee resource groups. My old employer, I used to work at Medtronic for many years. We had a number of employee resource groups, and they were just, very energetic organizations and really helped employees feel as though they were not alone and that they had a community to share their needs with and to provide channels to get additional support within their larger organizations. The second area that employers have to play a very key role in is emphasizing workforce diversity and integrating their HR resources and their other support services across that diversity landscape, again, so that people within the companies feel that they have channels to get the support that they need. The third area is a broad category, workplace training programs. These are very critical for different stages that employees are in within their employer landscape. And I can tell you that one of the things that the University of Minnesota is finding is that increasingly companies are coming to us for help with both the workforce diversity piece as well as the workforce training piece. And we're happy to kind of have that kind of dialogue. And the help that we're being asked to partner on, in one case for the workforce diversity category, it's helping to evaluate the success of existing programs and to determine what additional programs might be beneficial. And then also for workplace training programs, providing some initial support to get those training programs perhaps to a next level, and then also providing support for evaluating the success and the utilization of those programs. And then the third category that again is profiled in these case studies is the importance of community education and support. And this is where there's a lot of variation, I would say, in what communities are demonstrating and what they are moving forward with. In Worthington, where they have a very large Hispanic population, they have a number of different organizations, and I've listed some of this on the slide, that are really targeting that Hispanic population, providing some language support and language services. An example where one of these organizations has specifically partnered with the local police force to build awareness amongst the police individuals, and also to help immigrants learn how to navigate the legal system within that community. So that's quite an interesting example as well. The Community Connector program, also an example out of Worthington. This is one where, again, they're really trying to provide more bilingual services within the community. They've emphasized providing bilingual signage in Worthington to help immigrants navigate and feel more welcome. So a number of really interesting and different types of approaches that groups have taken. I suspect many of you, if you've been to Rochester, know about the Hawthorne School. Another great example of a successful program within that community, and an example that unites all three of these categories, because Hawthorne is really an example where we see support from nonprofits, we see some support from the employer, in this case Mayo, and we see support from the broader community. So that's another great example that I would point you to. And then NCIC is also a very interesting example focusing on integration. It stands for Nobles County Integration Collaborative. And this is sort of trying to bring together 6 different school districts around the county to create programming, extracurricular opportunities, because in many cases what they found is that immigrants, they don't necessarily feel welcome to participate in extracurricular activities. They don't feel as though that they would be included in those. So this particular organization saw that as one area of need that they are trying to address. So again, I don't mean to leave out any other great examples. This is always dangerous to put together one slide to highlight things when there's actually lots of great work going on. But these are just some examples that are profiled in this appendix. And we also provide another resource, Appendix B, which you can download, which is more of an annotated bibliography. That isn't Minnesota specific, but it's looking across the country at other examples and other issues to be aware of as we're trying to become ever more welcoming as a state and as a community. But again, the message I want to convey personally is I think there's a lot of great work underway that we can continue to learn from. And then one other resource that I didn't put on the slide, but I'd be happy to connect people to, is at the University of Minnesota, and this is the Center for Immigration Studies. And that's a very interesting program where immigrants are creating videos that document their journey. And those videos are available for communities to download and utilize. And there is a curriculum that goes along with those videos that highlight different key elements that are sort of in common across different experiences. And so those can be very nice additional pieces as communities are working through some of these topics.